Okay, as you guys probably know by now, I have a somewhat extensive collection of Yokomo YZ10s, a couple of 870Cs. This is one that I'm putting together right now. Some Yokomo Works models, is a Works 93, and there's a Works 92, and some 94 and 95 YZ10s. And they all behave a little bit different. I've raced the 870C, I've raced the 93 Works, I've raced the 94 and 95, and they all drive a little differently. But generally speaking, they all tend to behave in a kind of a stable fashion in terms of the cornering. They never quite cornered incredibly sharply. I'll put it that way, especially when compared to something like a Cat 2000 or Kyosho Laser, which, by the way, I also have right there. So, the laser in particular has very sharp steering because it tends to have a low caster angle. Even with the ZXRR front steering geometry with the wider front end and the larger caster angle, still has very, very sharp steering. Cat 2000, I have a 2000 and an EC. That one right there is the EC with the laydown shocks. I just put that one together a few weeks ago. That also has pretty insane steering. Probably because the center of gravity is low with the laydown shocks, and everything's really tightly packaged toward the center. So it's a low polar moment of inertia weight distribution, essentially, or mass distribution. So these two corner comparably sharply, and noticeably sharper than the YZ10, in this case the 93 Works. So then you figure, okay, well, how can I make this thing corner as sharply? Because I'd like to be able to run this with my like the 95 Yokomo YZ10, for instance, at the Vintage Off-Road National. So I have one car for classic four-wheel drive, one car for the conventional four-wheel drive class. We have two four-wheel drive classes at Vonats, by the way. And when you take a closer look at the YZ10, at least the ones that were based on the 870C platform, like the Works models and 870C, they're similar in the parts they use. There isn't that much in the way of adjustability, right? You have a few options here for inner camber link points on the front tower. I think there's two options on the rear tower. The rear hub, you can move it up or down. Like, there's a few little things here and there that you can tune. And if you try to take those out to some kind of extreme, that should give you better cornering. It's still not quite sharp enough cornering compared to what you get with a Cat or a Laser. So what other tricks can you play? And I realized last night or 2 nights ago, and I'm really kicking myself about this because I've had these cars for years, that you can also play around with the wheel hubs. And this is not something you might typically think about because there are certain wheel hubs that are used on the 870C. These are for the 870C. I think this goes on the rear and this goes on the front. And then these here, these narrower ones, these are used on the Works models. And ones that look very similar to this go on the 94 and 95 YZ10. Slightly different shape, but generally the same thickness here for the hub and the same offset and all the rest of it. So essentially, if you look across the different models, you have pretty much 3 thicknesses of wheel hubs. And the modern equivalent of this would be like having offset wheel hexes. So if you have like a B6.2 or a Kyosho RB7 or an X-Ray XB2 or whatever, you might be able to find wheel hexes that have different widths to them, so you can tune the track width of the car. Or if the car is really good, you'd have on the inner hinge pin blocks, you'd have little inserts you can use to make the car wider or narrower, and also like give the arms kick up or sweep or whatever. But you don't really have that on these older cars, and so the only way to adjust the width on the car is to either adjust at the caster block where it mounts onto the arm. Like on the Laser, you have 2 options for caster blocks that can do that. Or you find a way to change how the wheels are mounted, the offset of the wheel, essentially. So right now, if you run the 93 Works in stock trim, you would end up using these guys, and you might be struggling to get it to corner as sharply as a Cat. But what you could do alternatively is you can take this piece and run it on the front to make the front as narrow as possible. And then you could take the 870C rear wheel hub, which is much fatter and wider, and mount that on the rear. There's no modification necessary to do this. It just slots right on. And then this would push the rear wheels outward a bit and make the rear a little bit wider than the front. And generally speaking, when the front is narrower than the rear, you get more cornering. And that has to do with how the cornering forces are applied to the car and how it makes the suspension roll in certain ways when you corner. But you know, the general rule of thumb is narrower front and or wider rear gives you more steering. Okay, so you can do that, and you can also, you know, take note of the fact that the Works YZ10s and upwards, like 994 and 95, they had relatively flush wheels, whereas the 870C had some had offset rims. And I saw recently that JC Racing is reproducing 870C rims in 2.2 inch diameter. So now you can get conventional YZ10 rims and 870 rims, and the 870 rims have an offset, especially at the rear. Those are a deeper dish. So not only can you run a fatter a wheel hub, like an 870 wheel hub, on a Works model or a 94 or 95 model if you find that you need to get more steering, but you can add on top of that the deeper dish 870C rim to make the rear even wider and get more steering that way. Now, technically speaking, that might not be roar legal because the total rear width might exceed the roar legal limit for track width, or the IFMAR limit for track width. But generally at these vintage races, they don't really care about that. It's all about just running vintage cars and having fun with them. So this is a tuning option that you could use to help you get more steering on a YZ10. And it's really simple. Just get some 870C wheel hubs, front and rear, get some Works wheel hubs, and then you have 3 different wheel hubs that you can use. And if you want to even go a little bit more, have a little bit more granularity in between these, I can take this wheel hub, for instance, and you notice where like the wheel mounts this way. Okay, so the inside of the wheel is going to mount on this surface here. So I can just take that and flip it over, right? Now I have something that's kind of in between this wheel hub and this wheel hub, because now that pushes this surface up a little bit. And I can take this one, and I can also push it up. And that gives me something a little closer to this. And I can take this one and turn it around. And that gives me something even a little bit more pushed out. So you can play, you basically have 6 permutations here for how wide you can make the front or the rear of the car. Okay, just based on how you play around with these wheel hubs. Now, you just have to point out that if you do flip the wheel hubs around, so if you run this side here toward the inner bearing, you may have to put like a shim in there or something, because otherwise you have this entire surface rubbing against the bearing. The way it's meant to be mounted against the bearing is with this surface here. You have this tiny little, whatever you call it, lip or extension on the inside. That tiny little extension, that's what sort of mates against the inside piece of the inner bearing. So if you can flip it around technically, but you might get a little bit more friction unless you put like a little shim in there or something. But in any case, I just want to point that out for those of you who do run the YZ10 and just want to be aware of some extra tuning options that you can and should have at your disposal. Okay, thanks for watching.